Hi. All right. So today we are talking about the Cold War. This is going to start under President Truman. It's very appropriate timing because it is actually very cold today for Mobile. So here we are. All right. So let's discuss a few things that I wanted to talk to you about with foreign affairs. First of all, let's talk about the founding a little bit of the United Nations. So the United Nations is going to preliminarily meet at a place called Dunbarton Oaks. The problem is they're trying to figure out how they exactly want to make this international peacekeeping organization work. So one of the big issues they originally deal with is how to handle the Security Council. So finally, some of the Soviet reps who did not want to compromise are going to end up compromising. And so there we go. We've got it figured out. So let's discuss a little bit about the UN itself. The charter for the UN was signed on October 24th, 1945, and it has five major purposes, really. The first is to provide peace, the second, promote justice, the third, provide security, also increase the general welfare, and then lastly, establish human rights. And so there are six major agencies of the UN. The first is going to be the Security Council. The second, and that's the big one. The second is the General Assembly, which all countries have representation in. You also have the Economic and Social Council, and this group is going to study world economics and social and cultural and health problems around the world. You have the International Court of Justice, which will decide legal questions and give advisory opinions, but no enforcement rights. The Secretariat, which does administrative work. Your trusteeship council, which is going to make sure the welfare of people are taken care of. But let's go back and talk about the Security Council, which is the very first one I told you about. So with the Security Council, their purpose is to prevent war. So you have 11 members. 5 of those members are permanent. Those permanent members are going to be your big 5 nations from World War II. And so those are going to consist of the US, the USSR, China, France, and Great Britain. And then your others are going to be non-permanent members that are voted in into your terms. Now, why this is so significant is those permanent members have veto power. That means any action that relates to security and war the UN wants to do can be vetoed by these Security Council members. The US doesn't want to do it, veto doesn't happen. So this is significant. Now, something that is confusing oftentimes, that doesn't mean that other countries still can't take those actions, but it will not be made as the UN. There are 5 official languages in the UN. You have English, Spanish, French, Russian, and Mandarin. Many people say Chinese. It's kind of a misnomer, but still, basically, this makes sure that we reach all of those big 5. And then it also adds in Spanish because Spanish is the second most common common language in the world. So also there's going to be a lot of issues at the end of World War II with rebuilding both Japan and Germany. And so the US is going to take a role in that, especially with Japan. We're going to do a lot of limitations on what Japan can have militarily post-war. And we are going to provide them with a lot of things. And so after all of our rebuilding process is done, Japan really has kind of come up to date. And with that, they are going to eventually become one of the more technologically advanced nations in the world where they were previously really behind. So this isn't just a lose-lose situation where you were beating the war, but this also provides them with certain resources that they need. You will also see with the Cold War, Truman is going to follow a policy that comes from Secretary of State George Kennan. It's the policy of containment. The idea is that you want to put things, you want to put parameters around other things so they don't leak out. Now, this is my fantastic cup of coffee today. Very tasty. I'm sure you're all jealous, but I have it in a container. Why? Pretty good container. I don't want this to leak out. I want this to contain my coffee so that I can have my coffee in here. My coffee can be there, but it will not be contaminated by anything else. This is what we want to do with communism. We want to contain it. Why? Because at the end of World War II, 2 nations emerge leading the pack. You have the United States and you have the Soviet Union. And both of these emerge as these superpower roles. And when you have 2 that are really good at something, you begin to have a lot of tension and strife to develop between the 2. And so that's what happens. Who's going to outdo whom? Is it going to be the US that emerges superior, or is it going to be Russia, the Soviet Union, who emerges superior? Tune in, find out. So, what begins to happen is you begin to see this push to resist communism from expanding. That is going to be Truman's policy that he follows pretty religiously. So, with this, as the leader of what we call the free world and democracy, he is going to give aid and to stand for those ideas that he believes are freedom. So, resisting communism. Truman particularly puts these forth to Greece and Turkey. So he promises $400 million dollars to Greece and Turkey to help them in their respectable areas resist the spread of communism into their areas. So at the time, Stalin is still the leader of the Soviet Union. And so that is whom we are working against, essentially. You're also going to see with economic capitalism versus the communist economy, the command market economy, that you're going to see the USSR also begin to blockade our capitalist aggression, places that we were trying to go in and we were trying to promote our agenda as well. So, a lot of fear and suspicion is going to arise between the two because both see the other as this growing threat. And anytime we feel threatened, we tend to respond with aggression, just as people in general. And countries are going to do the same. So, an International Atomic Energy Commission is going to be created for the purpose of reaching agreements on the international control of the atomic bomb. So, what becomes interesting here is the United States. We opened this Pandora's box. Now, granted, other people were trying to open it as well, but we are the ones who pop that cork and are like, yay, here are the bombs. And so, Russia very quickly is going to have one soon, and we will discuss that shortly. And so, when this group met, the U.S. is going to be represented by a guy named Bernard Baruch, and America is going to put some stipulations out there first. We want these weapons to be controlled by an international agency. Russia says no international control. They don't want that. So, in other words, the UN will not have control of that. That is not what Russia wants. Soviet Union. Second, we want inspection of energy installations so that if there are places that bombs are being built, that nuclear things are being used, we want that to be checked out so that everybody is on the up and up. The Soviets are kind of like, yeah, we're not wanting to check all that out. Let's kind of keep our stuff, our stuff. We're like, no, we want to know what you got. So this is not going well. We say, hey, look, we'll reveal our secrets. And they're like, don't reveal your secrets, destroy your bombs. We don't all need to have these. Now, at the same time, they're working on these things. We want atomic warfare to be made illegal, no manufacturing. That is what the US wants. And the Soviet Union agrees. They feel like atomic warfare should be made illegal. We don't need to blow the planet up time and time again. And so, no manufacturing. And the United States also feels it is very important to retain their veto on the Security Council, which the Soviet Union has that same sentiment. So you see this kind of fear that is bubbling between these two groups becomes almost palpable. So when Truman puts forth this Truman Doctrine in 1947 that gives aid to Greece and Turkey to kind of resist what's going on with Russia, you can see that it is not just in meetings, but it is also spilling over into other areas of our world. So let's talk about in 1948. In 1948, Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been a major leader in World War II, is going to travel to Europe, and he is going to see the absolute devastation there. And he is very fearful. Why? Because when places are left in destitute, then they tend to often fall into worse scenarios. For instance, you got that whole World War II Hitler thing where we just basically left Germany to crap, and we're like, hey, let's just see what happens with you guys. And of course, you have a radical dictator who comes in and takes over and does horrible things. And so that is our fear. That's the fear that Marshall has. If we do not help Europe rebuild, what could they fall into? Could it be worse than what happened in Germany? And so he proposes what becomes known as the Marshall Plan. This plan would provide money, US money, $12.5 billion to be exact, for supplies, for machinery and things to help nations affected by World War II rebuild their destroyed country. That's what we want to do. So great things here, a lot of money. But the idea is if we restore the economies of these places, then perhaps they're not as likely to fall into such bad times. So, how does that go? Well, most of the nations take us up on it, but not Russia. We do offer it to the Soviet Union. We do offer it to her satellite nations, but she does not jump on this. We see instead it's more places that we were friendly with who are going to take up this offer. So, moving to a different part, at the end of World War II, Germany is going to be split into four places. The Russians, the Soviet Union, had advanced to Eastern Germany, even taking the city of Berlin. And so the United States, Great Britain, and France are going to have three smaller pieces on the Western side. And so what happens is those Western sides are all, the Western side is all non communist. And so those pieces are going to kind of merge together in what's going to become West Germany. And then the Soviet Union side is going to become East Germany. Now, the city of Berlin is also going to be split into East and West. So, what happens here is that because of some building tension, Stalin becomes very frustrated with these guys. And he decides that he is going to cut off Berlin so that the West is not able to get into it. Basically, he puts up roadblocks. It's called the Berlin blockade. This is not the Berlin Wall. Do not confuse the two. It happens a lot, but this is the Berlin blockade. He blocks roads, he blocks railroads, he blocks waterways. Any way that you could get into Berlin, he blocks it. Now, why does he do this? Well, because he basically wants to shut down Berlin to where eventually the West Berliners are going to be forced to join with the East Berliners and the city will no longer be split. This takes place from June the 24th, 1948 until May 12th, 1949. What is going to stop it? The Berlin airlift. Now, this is a massive undertaking of daily flights, and I believe it was 5,000 tons of cargo that has to be delivered daily in like 200 planes. It's insane. I'll have to go back and look because I think that number is off. But it is a ridiculous amount of supplies that the people need. They actually go to the trouble to figure out how many daily calories the people in Berlin need to survive versus how many people are there, and they start to supply those goods. I'm also going to attach the video. There's a really good one that defines the Berlin airlift. It is not very long, but I would really suggest you watch it because it goes into a lot of the logistics that are just mind-boggling to see what all went into making this work. And so literally, Stalin has this blockade in place for 11 months. But finally, the US and Great Britain with this airlift, they get it up and running, and it's up and running successfully. So it brings you to a point, if you were Stalin here, that you have to say, okay, it's not working. So do I just keep this wall up and show that my idea has failed, or do I take it down? And so that is what he does. He takes it down and says, you know what? Okay, didn't work. And so West Berlin is once again open to influence from West Germany to supplies. All right. So let's talk about alliances in Europe. The first group that is going to form is going to be NATO. NATO forms the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is an alliance between the free part of Western Europe, the non-communist countries, US, Canada, and Iceland. And so these areas right around that North Atlantic are going to form together to make NATO. The idea behind this is they would defend each other in case of an attack. Now, not an alliance or anything here, right? Very obviously an alliance. That is going to be followed up a little bit later with a group called the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the Soviet Union and her satellite states. And so you have NATO and Warsaw. If one nation's attacked, war. And so it is very, very tense. As this is happening, the nations are quickly building up their nuclear weapons as fast as they can, trying to outdo each other at the same time that they're talking about that we don't need to have nuclear weapons. Not hypocritical at all here, right? But it is what they are doing. So civil war does break out in China, where we do see the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong are going to attack the nationalists in China under Chiang Kai shek. And what ends up happening is the nationalists are going to be forced to escape. They're going to be forced to leave China. Many go to Taiwan and to Hawaii to try to get out and to try uh, to leave. And so the US and the Soviet Unions are both going to help their respective sides. But when it's all said and done in 1949, China becomes communist. Now, for the United States, they really didn't feel like that they did enough to prevent the spread of communism, and their policy is supposed to be containment. And here China is one of the largest countries in the world with the largest population, and you've let it fall to communism. And so the US kind of becomes hypersensitive to even more so containing, which brings us into 1950. So, because of some tension with the Soviet Union and China over what happened in China, they are both boycotting the UN, which is very significant with what we're going to talk about next. In 1950, North Korea is going to invade South Korea. And they are going to invade past that 38th parallel, which had been set as the dividing line, all the way into South Korea to a little tiny spot on the bottom uh, eastern side there. Very, very tiny. And the idea with this is they were told, their goal was to completely conquer. Well, I mean, they're down to just this little tiny part on the map. And so the UN takes a vote and they decide to get involved because neutral South Korea has been invaded by North Korea. So the US is going to lead a large part of the UN invasion by sending a US general, General Douglas MacArthur. And so MacArthur launches a three-prong invasion called the Incheon invasion. It's going to come in at the 38th parallel. Then part of the troops are going to go north to push those North Koreans back way into their area, which we will get to that in a minute. And part is going to go south to liberate that southern part of Korea, which has been overtaken by these communist invaders. And so what takes place is MacArthur actually kind of oversteps a little bit here. So he actually pushes all the way into China. Well, the Chinese are very upset that they have technically been invaded and violated by MacArthur. And so they're going to join with that North Korean army and push back to the 38th parallel. Well, MacArthur is not really happy about this. He feels like he has been let down, basically. And so he becomes very bitter and he makes the decision that what he wants to do is he wants to launch a nuclear attack on China. Now, yeah, no, we don't want to do that. So President Truman says, we're not nuking China, MacArthur. And MacArthur's like, oh, yes, we are. And so he publicly starts to talk about the president for not wanting to nuke China. Now, as we have talked about in our history class, it usually never goes well for people who openly, blatantly go against presidential policy. MacArthur kind of overestimated his role and his power by doing this. And so what Truman ends up having to do is he ends up having to fight back by firing Douglas MacArthur. Very controversial decision, but a very necessary decision. So basically, we say in this stalemate, Korea is kind of stuck at that 38th parallel because President Truman is committed to this idea of containment. He does not want to expand that war. Contain communism where it exists. Don't expand the conflict. So what's going to transpire from here is that the Korean War basically stays in a stalemate. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower runs for president for the Republican Party, which we'll talk about a lot in our Eisenhower video. And with this, he is going to say that he wants to go and negotiate the war. And so he does. He gets very actively involved in Korea. He goes over, he helps negotiate what becomes known as the Korean Armistice, which reestablishes the 38th parallel and it ends the conflict. So there you go. But we will come back and talk about Eisenhower later. So that is pretty much a basic kind of rundown of the Korean War. There's a lot more complicated ins and outs, but if you just want the nuts and bolts, that's it. So a little bit about Truman's domestic policy, because we've talked a lot about his foreign policy. One of my favorite things about Harry Truman is one of the very first things that he does. Not long after coming into office, well, a little bit after coming into office, but not long after World War II ended, Harry Truman is going to help end segregation in the military forces for African Americans by signing an executive order that declared the army, the military, to be desegregated. That's not the only thing Truman does for soldiers. Truman also is going to sign off on the GI Bill of Rights. GI, government issued, is a title for soldiers. At the end of World War I, if you remember, there were all of these problems after World War I with shortages of jobs. Soldiers didn't make as much money in World War I as workers in factories. That's better in World War II. And so, also going back to the pre regulated war era. So, how do you reestablish all that? Well, some things needed to be done. And so, what Congress comes up with and Truman supports in 1944, well, it's passed in 1944, but it's going to be issued under Truman's administration, is going to be the GI Bill of Rights. Basically, how do you demobilize with prosperity and extend these New Deal programs? So, to help this happen, they're going to give loans to your GIs to set up businesses or farms. And these just weren't available to white GIs, as I always like to mention that. Also, they're going to give low interest loans for homes, which is going to couple perfectly with the growth of suburbs that are going to take place very shortly, as well as pensions and hospital care. The big one that people always think about with the GI Bill isn't actually any of these, but instead they think about education. Soldiers are going to be given education, college education, and that is going to be huge. This is going to start a tradition in the United States of the idea that when we finish school, we go to college. The majority of Americans have that mindset that that's what the next step should be. And so that is what is going to be promoted because of this. It's also going to create some issues as well because this was available to all people, as I said. And a lot of your segregated, because most schools in the South, especially, were segregated, there were historically Black colleges, but everybody's enrollment soars so much that there are a lot of GIs who want to go to school, especially minorities, who cannot find places to go because of this situation. All right. So let's mention a little bit about the Taft-Hartley law. So we talked about the Wagner Act, which was the Magna Carta of labor. It established that labor unions had a right to collectively bargain. So under the Taft-Hartley law, there are going to be some things that are going to be addressed because the people in general were having problems with inflation. They needed price control to keep things stable. Workers needed higher wages, which they're going to get in the 50s. They also needed rent control and basically help with strikes. And so, what's going to take place is they're going to allow some restrictions on unions. In fact, under the Taft-Hartley, management could seek injunctions to end strikes and could also use could also sue union officials for violations of those injunctions, as well as they are going to forbade closed shops. This was the idea that you had to be in a union to work at specific places, and they're going to make that illegal. The president could also require an 80-day cooling off period when a strike threatened the health and the safety of the community, of the workers. And so all of this is somewhat restrictive. And then also they were required to sign a non-communist oath because oftentimes unions were thought about as being a little more communist. Now, Truman does veto the rent control part, but you do see this is going to put some limits on some of the successes that unions had been having. All right, so let's see. Let's look at the search for communists a little bit. So there were communists. Well, there were people who were working in the government who had spied for the Russians. And what we're going to see with those people is that they are going to get in trouble, for lack of a better way to say it. They're going to get in trouble because of what they're doing here. So a couple of them. One of the first we want to mention is going to be a married couple, actually. And their actions are going to come about because all of a sudden the Russians have managed to acquire the way to produce the atomic bomb. And so so that's going to bring a lot of fear and concern. The second thing that we're going to see is that the second thing that we're going to see is going to be that, and then I'm missing something. Right? Okay, yeah. And so because of that, they're going to be arrested and charged. This couple is named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and so the Rosenbergs are going to be charged with basically treason. Both of them said they had nothing to do with spying. Julius was emphatic. They kind of offer him even deals, let us know, maybe we can crack something for Ethel. But they both go to the electric chair over this. And it definitely comes out in the 90s. There's actual proof. Yeah, they were definitely communist spies. And that's how, well, he was more so than she. But that is how the nuclear recipe kind of ends up there. Also, high up member in the Department of Agriculture, a guy by the name of Alger Hiss. He is going to be accused of spying. Although they have a hard time proving that he was a spy with the House Un-American Activities Committee, they are going to manage to prove that he's a liar. And at the time, that could be just as powerful. And so he lies about being about knowing this man named Whitaker Chambers. And Whitaker Chambers actually had documentation that they knew each other. And so that documentation is going to be produced. They can't bust his for spying, but they can bust him for lying under oath. So that is going to be huge. So let's talk a little bit about the election of 1948. In 1948, Truman is going to run for a first term on his own. The Democratic Party is going to split because there were a lot of people in the Democratic Party from the South who did not like Truman's stance on civil rights and his support for civil rights. And so they're going to back a candidate from the Carolinas, a guy by the name of Strom Thurmond, who was a very known segregationist and was adamantly opposed to civil rights. And so what we're going to see with this is that Strom Thurmond comes in. Truman is the incumbent. And he is going to work to repeal Truman works to repeal some of these restrictions on unions. Truman wants more support on housing, education, and farmers. Truman wants more civil rights. He wants to broaden Social Security with his fair deal. He wants to raise minimum wage. He wants rent control. He wants farm support. You name it. He wants more people in civil service. And Strom Thurmond wants states' rights. And so he splits the Democratic Party, and his group is going to be known as the Dixiecrats, or the States' Rights Party. And so what takes place is there is the Republican candidate, Dewey. And so it looks like Dewey is going to win this election to the point that on election night, the Chicago paper gets a little ambitious, and they go ahead and print a headline that says, Dewey defeats Truman. However, by the time all the results came in, Truman held his own, and he becomes one of the few examples in history where a party splits and the guy from the splitting party manages to win. But it happens. And so Truman gets a term of his own that extends through this. Of course, the time period that we talked about, the Korean War, that is going to be during his second administration. But I just want you to kind of have that idea of how that ran. So we will talk about the 1950s, 52 to 1960, with Dwight D. Eisenhower in our next discussion. And I will make sure to upload the video of the Berlin airlift. And if you have any questions, please make sure to post your questions by Wednesday. Post your initial response by Friday, and then post your final responses by Sunday. And then whatever other assignments we have are always due on Sunday. Have a great week. Thank you. Bye.